Okay. Who belongs? So we're going to discuss this basic question of justice. Who belongs? And it's a basic question of membership and standing. Who should have membership? And what kind of standing one should have in one's society. On what basis should we determine who should have membership? And on what basis do we determine their standing in the society? Standing I'm using it as a general term here, but it comes from legal principle. In the law, one can only bring a case before a court if one has standing. That is, if one has an interest, one has been harmed in some way, or one has an interest in the issue before the court. So you and I just can't walk off the street into a court and expect to be heard. We would be dismissed by the judge. The judge would ask us to leave the courtroom because we lack standing. We have to petition the court and before we can be granted standing. So in a more general sense, in a social sense, standing may refer to our position in the society. And whether the society should be arranged hierarchically or should be arranged based upon a principle of equality. And membership is very important, the question of membership, because it constitutes the right to have rights. So if one doesn't have membership and therefore standing in the society in some way, one is not justified in pursuing one's claims. So it's a very, very basic idea. If we go back to ancient Greece, for example, probably familiar with the trial of Socrates. Socrates was indicted and convicted of corrupting the youth of Athens, and he was sentenced to death by hemlock for corrupting the youth of Athens. He went around asking too many questions and got everyone pissed off. So they tried him and they convicted him. And so he was waiting for his execution, and his friends came to him and said, Socrates, you can leave. We've arranged an escape. You can leave Athens and go somewhere else and live out your life. And Socrates, famously in one of Plato's dialogues, said, no, exile would be worse than death. I'm an Athenian. I've lived my whole life in Athens. It's who I am. Exile, not acceptable. I'd rather be dead. And so he drank the hemlock and perished. That story suggests the importance, perhaps, of membership. And it's very basic. If we're stateless, if we don't have a country, if we don't have membership in a society, that is a difficult position to be in. And of course, many people are in the world, refugees, et cetera, are in that position. And to be a quote, stateless person is really difficult. Some would say it's possibly the worst fate. Socrates would say it's worse than death. So membership and equal standing are of singular importance. And a just society should determine membership and standing. The basic assumption here is that we should determine membership on the basis of some agreed upon principles of justice, and perhaps some valid, justifiable political values. And from our perspective of moral reasoning in terms of fairness, these principles of justice that should determine membership should be fair. They should be consistent with the elements of fairness, equality, recognition, reciprocity, and impartiality. So that's the basic framework for moving forward on this question. The first step is to acknowledge that as human beings, we have a very strong need to belong in a social group. Social group belonging seems to be fundamental to who we are as beings. And that's probably due to our evolution, in part at least, our evolution as a species. To be outside of a group certainly probably meant death, to be outside of a group, because one could only survive in the context of a tribe or a social group early on in our evolution as a species. And of course, humans, the original Homo sapiens, lived in groups, and they were a source of protection and survival. So I think we've inherited, many believe we've inherited this tendency or this need to be in groups, in social groups. We're social beings. There are three primal aspects of human psychology and evolution related to social group belonging. And this begins with reflection in ancient Greece. And they developed a term, timos, which they argued there's a basic need as a social being. We have a basic need to be recognized by our group. And that we can be recognized in two forms. One form is a desire to be recognized as a superior, and the second form is a desire to be recognized as an equal. And there's always a tension between those needs of being recognized to stand out from the crowd, from the group, in terms of one's achievement, and this can take a pathological form of domination in the group, plus a desire, corresponding desire to be recognized. We're all equal. A desire to be equal. So those are two very powerful tendencies or needs that we have psychologically. And this is well recognized going back to at least 2,500 years. A third aspect, a third basic tendency is to order the social world in terms of an us-them dichotomy. We have a strong tendency also to identify with our group, whatever that group might be, usually an ethnic group or a religious group, and to order the social world in terms of an opposition to others, to people outside of our group. So there's a strong us-them dichotomy, and when influenced by megalophymia, the desire to be recognized as a superior, which gives fuel to an in-group and out-group bias, an in-group bias and an out-group hostility. So we're wired, and this is a problem for us, we're wired, seemingly, to use those words, to favor people in our own social group that we have identified with. And to have some kind of hostility. It could be very minor hostility or disfavor toward the outside member, or it could be quite hostile, as we know, to the outside members. So those are very basic dynamics relating to our need for social group belonging. Make sense so far? Any questions? Does this seem plausible? Seem feasible? Okay. So given our need for belonging, we construct the social world. We tend to construct the social world in terms of group membership and identity. So we also identify ourselves with the group as well. And we construct our own individual sense of identity based upon our group membership. And you can, in a more trivial sense, this is you can see this with sports fans. Yeah, I'm a Bears fan. Or Go Rockets. Or the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry. Or the Toledo Bowling Green rivalry. We have to prevail over those Bowling Greeners. Right? We must prevail. And sports like fan support like that triggers those basic tendencies that we have in a more trivial sense, around a silly game, silly games. But they become somehow fierce, right? Their team loses and they get depressed. Oh no, what's happening? I've been there myself. So we have this tendency, and this is backed up by some very important and original social psychological research, which I'll explain in a minute. So our perceptions and behavior towards others, how we relate to others, inside and outside our groups, our social groups, especially our primary social groups. We structure the social world in terms of in-group and out-group characterizations. And that's the way we create social boundaries that shape our self-identity. So self-identity is based in group identity. Our self-image is constructed in dialogue with the culture of our main social groups. We might be members of more than one social group, and that will make our identity more complex. And this could be ethnic, it could be cultural, it could be racial, it could be gender, etc. Religious, etc. Group inclusion, who belongs, and group differentiation, who doesn't belong, in group, out group, is driven by thymos, is driven both by the desire to be equal, but also the desire to be separate and stand out from others. When it's driven by the desire to be superior to others, megalothemia, the desire to be different from and superior to others, strengthens in-group bias and out-group hostility. There are two famous studies in social psychology. One was by Henri Tajfel and his colleagues. What they did was, this was in the 1950s, they identified a group of young young boys, youth, teenagers, 15, 16 years old. And they were all and they were going to take this group, they took this group on a camping trip. A group of 30 boys, high school boys. And these boys were similar. They were all white. They came from the same neighborhood. They went to school together. Culturally, they were pretty identical. Not much differentiation between them on that level. And that was by design. That they were homogeneous in their background. So they took these boys on a camping trip, and they, at first, the first thing they did was they split them into two groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers, they called them. And they began a beginning competition between the Eagles and the Rattlers. Games or activities that pit the two groups against each other. And almost immediately, in-group bias and out-group hostility emerged within the two groups. They became actually quite hostile to each other. In fact, the researchers had to call off the experiment. It got heated. They were afraid that the boys would harm each other. The competition became so intense. And it was arbitrary, Eagles, Rattlers. Didn't mean anything. Arbitrary social group classification with competition leading to, it triggered a kind of tribalism. They became two tribes, hostile against each other. A similar study was done after Taj fell by Muzaffar Sharif and his colleagues. And they wanted to replicate Taj Fell's findings. They used a different device. They brought in adults this time, and they put them before they arbitrarily grouped them by asking them some very arbitrary and simple questions. Do you think this? Do you think this? Do you like blue? Do you like red? Kind of trivial questions, arbitrary, no meaning to them. And based upon how they responded to those questions, they formed two groups. They were grouped into two different groups. And they were then asked in each group to distribute a block of money between themselves and the other group. And we're going to distribute, you're charged with defining a principle of distribution of this money. In fact, a trivial amount of money. What happened, what the researchers found was that there was in-group bias. In-group bias. The members of the groups favored each other, even though the groups were arbitrary, right? They weren't families or religious groups or cultural groups. They weren't from the same neighborhood. They were totally arbitrary. But that triggered the grouping itself triggered this bias, this in-group bias in favor. So they distributed the money. They proposed to distribute the money in favor of the group, right? And in disfavor to the other group. And both groups did this. And they concluded these two studies, and there's been more research, a lot more research, that our tendencies for in-group bias and out-group hostility, our tendencies for tribalism, to be a tribe, and to view the other group with suspicion or lack of favor, can be very easily triggered. It's very easily triggered. And that suggests that we have these basic tendencies. We could call it tribal tendencies. We're very tribal in that sense. Questions? That makes sense. Sound feasible? Is this within your own experience to favor? It's almost unconscious to even, to sit with people that we identify as our own group. We have to make an extra effort maybe to, well, today I'm going to venture out of the group and see what life is like outside of it. And we can't do that often. And that can be very rewarding and important. But that's a counter to our basic tendency for group identity. So our perceptions and understandings of others are deeply, seemingly shaped by our group identity. It's kind of a lens we look through on the world. So we see others who are different, maybe. We perceive them as different, but we see them as different through the lens of our own cultural group. Whether that can be overcome is a big question. I think it can, but it's there, right? We're very tribal. It's very easily triggered. And there are forces in the world, and there are people in the world who take advantage of this and attempt to weaponize our tendency for in-group bias and out-group hostility. Politicians, for example, of a certain ilk, want to divide by invoking these differences. We see this regularly in the political. Other politicians want to unite, some politician wants to polarize and divide. And sophisticated means of polarizing groups have been in play throughout human history and are still at play strongly in our own time, in our own society. Would you agree? Mm-hmm. And race has been a big one, right? Dividing people by race, by ethnicity, by religion. It's a very, very big differentiator, right? Leading to all kinds of violence in cases, religious violence. And it's all about this group struggle, it seems, or at least in part about the group struggle. And this can take the form of what we could call nationalism. Hierarchical societies or unequal societies tend to invoke the idea of nationalism, and they appeal to identity-based ideologies such as nationalism to serve as a justification for determining social membership and standing. And we there has been, and this has been very prevalent in human history, to define membership in terms of some kind of ethnicity or some kind of religious background. And if you don't have that ethnicity or that religious belief, then you're excluded from or it is argued you should be excluded. You're not really a full standing member of the society because you're different. That's ethno-nationalism. White supremacists, for example, strongly invoke ethno-based ideology to determine membership. You've heard that some people argue that the United States membership in the United States should be based upon being white and Christian. That America was founded as a white Christian nation. And that's who we are. And we're threatened, we white Christian believers are threatened by the diversity in the society, immigration, etc. The election in Italy, of the Prime Minister in Italy just last week, she ran on a campaign of ethno-nationalism and based upon a replacement theory. The argument that the true Italians who trace their lineage back to Rome or Florence are being replaced by immigrants from the Middle East, from Africa in particular. We're losing our Italian nation. Vote for me, because I will stand strong. Or Donald Trump in 2016. I will build a wall, and who will pay for it? Mexico. We will build a wall. If you elect me president, we're going to build a wall to keep the Mexicans, the rapists, the criminals, the drug addicts, implying that all Mexicans are drug addicts, rapists, etc., out of our country. Because this is an existential threat to our group. We have to build a wall. We're going to make Mexico pay for it, those fuckers. Right? Of course, there was never any intention of building a wall, and no one believed, really, that Mexico was going to pay for the wall. Right? But it was a device to ignite polarization between people. So we could, one principle, therefore, is to decide membership based upon some ethnic background or some religious background. That's a principle of membership. So we should define ourselves in terms of our racial or our ethnic background, or we should define ourselves in terms of religion. I don't think you can immigrate to Saudi Arabia very easily, right? Could I immigrate to Saudi Arabia? Could I become a citizen of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? Could you? Not that you would want to. I don't think so. We would have to convert, right? Maybe then we could be admitted, but that would be difficult. Not a lot of immigration allowed into the kingdom. But it's based on an ethnicity and a religious belief system that you have to, it's a religious state, a monarchy, and based in a certain religious point of view. They said no. They're basing Saudi Arabia and others, it's quite common historically, is basing they have a principle of a religious principle to determine membership in the society. Iran, etc. Is that clear? Mm-hmm. When this is fueled, this nationalism can be fueled by the desire to be superior to others. And when that happens, when that's included in nationalism, that we're better than others, we're superior to others, that can lead to a desire to dominate others, to dominate other groups, and then including to dominate other countries, perhaps, to rule the world. In the center of the world, we should be dominating. The Chinese have a long history of believing that they're superior to everyone else in the world. The Middle Kingdom. The center of the universe is in Xi'an, the city of Xi'an, the ancient capital. Everyone else is on a lesser level of humanity. Not that every Chinese person reads that name. And we have our own version of that, right? In the United States, we have this myth of exceptionalism, the greatest country that has ever existed in human history. We are the best. USA, USA, USA. You've heard the chants. It's a belief. It's fuel. That's a fuel, right? Belief in, yeah, it makes us feel good, right? We think we're the best. A city on a hill. It's fuel. Makes people feel good. But it has a downside. It's one, very obnoxious, whoever's doing it. And two, it can lead to further division and hostility, even to violence between groups of people.
Do you think the lines between patriotism and nationalism have been just blurred in the United States at this point? Because, I mean, there's always something, we're supposed to be proud to be American, we're supposed to be patriotic, but it's gotten to a point where I think someone said you can't drive a mile in America without seeing an American flag or a McDonald's, which is true, because everywhere you go, you're going to go see the two. One is because it's very common food, but other is because our flag is displayed everywhere, and that is not common in other countries.
Yeah. Patriotism can be nationalistic and grounded in superiority, a drive for superiority. But patriotism can also be grounded in principle. And we'll talk about this. It can be, what are we proud of? If we are proud of being an American, which we are, what does that mean? What are we proud of? One is to identify that as kind of an ethnicity. Yeah, we're Americans. But on a deeper level and a better, more just, fair level, we're proud of being an American because we have adopted certain principles and values and that we stand for. And to be an American is to adopt those principles rather than to be a member of an ethnic group or a religious group. That's the way forward. And in a way, our country has also found there's a strong ethnic hostility in U.S. history, but also the idea that we are a nation based on principle, moral and political principle, rather than on some religious or ethnic background. We welcome you in our immigration policy. You want to come to you want to be a citizen? Wonderful. We will accept you on one condition. You affirm our principles, our democratic, republican principles. You adhere to those principles. So if you go to a swearing-in ceremony of new citizens, it's a beautiful thing. It's something to be proud of. They all pledge their affirmation to the principles upon which the society is based. They're not pledging white power, or black power, or Chinese power, or a religion. They're affirming a principle. And that seems better, more fair, we could argue. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Very important. So, I think a more fair way to proceed, and we'll argue for this, a fair way to proceed is to proceed on principle, to determine membership and standing based upon some kind of principle, rather than on some kind of identity. I favor the principle rather than the identity. But it's a choice we need to make. And in general, it's been back and forth in our history. we have a lot of identity-based hostility. But I think the hope may be, I'm hopeful that if we affirm principle over identity, then we can be fair, have a more just system of membership in our society, and a more equal and fair society. You know, we're wired to be to discriminate in a malicious way, in a hostile way. But I think that can be overcome. We can overcome that. We can overcome that by affirming the principle over ethnicity or religious belief. Long-winded answer. Did that answer?
Yes, it did. Yes.
Very important. So we have this this nationalistic tendency, the drive to be superior, and we can locate very historic ideologies and social structures based upon the racial segregation, racial discrimination is based in the white supremacy, patriarchy, belief that men are superior to women, males are superior to females, is also a version of this dynamic. And as I suggested, this can be weaponized. In the world, the drive to domination is quite potent in the world, and it can lead to the pursuit of certain nations who are animated by a drive to superiority. They can pursue dominant power in the world and to have others comply with their dominance. We, as in our history, there are versions of this being the case where the United States has sought certain kinds of domination in the world. Imperialism and colonialism is driven and remains driven by this desire, along with economic wealth, the desire to dominate and be superior to others. The British, in their empire, the British Empire was based in a belief of the superiority of the British people, that they were somehow superior to others, especially Africans, Asians, and built an empire. The Europeans built empires based upon a drive to be superior to others and a belief in their superiority. And they pulled it off for a while until it ended. It collapsed under its own contradictions. This can be quite destructive. This drive for domination and superiority over others is a source of great conflict and violence in the world, and remains so. An example is, of course, what Russia is doing, and the Putin doctrine we discussed. Russia's superior, right? The Russian people are superior to the Ukrainian people. Ukraine isn't really a country. Shouldn't really exist, according to Putin. We are superior, and we will dominate. Wrong. Good luck with that. Good luck with that, but it's an example. And we've had our own versions of that. The Bush doctrine, George W. Bush's administration, crafted by Dick Cheney, Vice President, was the national security strategy of the United States, and you can read it, Google it, was to dominate the world. That was the national security prevent any rival from existing militarily and economically. We will use military force to crush any rival. That was the pretext for the invasion of Iraq. Didn't go so well. I think driven by, it was driven by domination and superiority. Where the U.S. is better. When you encounter this tendency in your everyday life and you meet someone who feels superior or behaves in a way that you think they're superior to you, how does that feel? Do you like that? Or looking down on you because you're different from them. It's terrible, right? It's terrible. And we experience that's also common. I've experienced it myself. I'll give you an example. I attended many conferences in my career. I was at a conference and I'm standing with a colleague from Columbia University. We're talking and we have our name tags on with our affiliation on the University of Toledo. He's Columbia University, Ivy League. And someone comes up and introduces themselves and he reads our name tag and our affiliation. And he completely ignores me from then on, because in his eye, I got to talk to the guy from Columbia. But in reality, I was a more accomplished scholar than the guy from Columbia. But because I was identified with what in his eyes was a lesser institution, academia can be very elitist, compared relative to Columbia University, this par with Harvard, I wasn't worth talking to. Didn't feel very good. I didn't like it. I don't like it ever. It's crazy, rude, etc. Not life-threatening. Okay, bye. Have a good life. But it's there, isn't it? Even in our daily. It's very much there in our daily experiences. In-group, out-group dynamic. Who is standing, who doesn't, who has membership, who doesn't, who's superior to someone else. And it can play out on the world stage in very hostile and disruptive ways. So we can turn to an analysis here of, in terms of fairness of criteria, of the criteria of identity-based membership. We could argue that membership, the criteria of membership and standing in terms of tribalism defined by racial, ethnic, cultural, or gender group creates social systems that are unequal, that are hierarchically unequal. Some on the top, some on the bottom, some in the middle. We have this hierarchy of inequality. And historically, that's how most of human societies have been organized, is through some kind of hierarchy, with some on top, some in the middle, and most of the people usually on the bottom. Medieval feudalism is an example. You have a monarch, an aristocracy, and feudal lords, and you have the clergy, and you have then the peasants, common person, who is in hierarchical societies, you're born into a certain social class, and that's where there's no mobility across those classes, or very little chance for mobility. If you were born a peasant, you will most likely die a peasant. If you are born in a lordship, you will die in a lordship. And there are remnants of that in our societies. But we could argue that identity-based ideologies, that determining who belongs based on identity-based ideologies is inconsistent with the imperatives of fairness. From our moral point of view, the moral point of view of fairness, we could argue that determining membership based upon some kind of ethnic or cultural or religious identity is unfair. Is unfair. It's not equal, violates equality and the recognition of equality. It's not, it doesn't, it's disrespectful of many persons. Those who are excluded have valid reasons to reject, and it's not impartial. It has a profound partiality to it. We're going to discriminate on a partial basis who belongs and who doesn't. So and you read about this in the chapter, Who Belongs chapter, or will read about it. So I think there's good reason to reject determining membership and standing based upon race, ethnicity, religion, and gender, etc. I think there's very good reason to reject determining membership and standing on those bases. Because I think it's clear that they violate fairness. What do you think? That's one consideration that we'll have in our thinking about who belongs, and the principles that should determine who belongs is whether an ethno-based, identity-based determination is valid or not in terms of fairness. So you'll be confronted, or you'll be confronted with that question in your writing on this question. I think it can be argued that a plausible argument that it's not fair to all involved. And therefore, fairness requires that we transcend our identities based in ascriptive and arbitrary characteristics. And we have to find a way to go beyond our tribalism, in other words, in determining membership and standing. So it could be argued that, well, equal reciprocal recognition affirms that membership and standing should not be determined by appeal to these characteristics. They are morally arbitrary. So then we could ask, on what basis then, if we were going to reject ethnic identity as the basis of membership, on what other basis and what other principle could we appeal to determine membership? One that is consistent with the elements of fairness. And as I noted earlier in response to Angelina's question, one way forward is to think about a civic identity that's superordinate in the sense that it transcends, goes beyond our specific tribal identification, whatever that might be. And I it's creedal in the sense that it's based in a creed, a political, moral creed of principles. And this is one possibility, that we can forge a common political identity grounded in shared values and principles of justice, and that we can, in a sense, form a civic identity around those principles and identify ourselves with those principles. Yes, I'm an American because I believe in these principles. I'm not an American because I'm white or Christian or whatever. I'm an American because I believe in a set of values. I believe in liberty. I believe in democracy. I believe in the rule of law. I affirm those. And that's what I identify with. And that would form that forms a civic identity. So if we might be of different ethnicities, but if we share the same principles, then we have a shared common citizenship and identity around those principles. Yeah, we're Americans, right? We believe in the same basic, fundamental ideas, even though we look different, or even believe in a different God or no God, whatever. So the way forward possibly is to have a civic identity based in principles, a principled civic identity that can be the basis of membership and standing. And this civic identity should instantiate equal recognition and fairness. So then, what could be possibly what could be those principles? And one of them is, one possible principle is a principle of toleration or tolerance. And that's a counter to tribalism, is the affirmation of respect-based tolerance or toleration. That contrasts with a permission conception of toleration, and this has been historically prevalent, the permission conception of tolerance. Well, speaking of a minority group of whatever kind, we will tolerate you. We will let you live in practice in the ways that you want, as long as you don't challenge the dominance of the majority group, or even in some cases even interact with the majority group. You can have your own neighborhood. You just stay in the neighborhood, and we'll tolerate you in that sense, as long as you don't mess with us, and as long as you accept your inferior position, your unequal position in the society, then we'll tolerate you. We'll let you live the way you want, as long as you don't mess with us. That's a permission conception of toleration, and it's flawed. It's unfair, it's unequal, it violates reciprocity. The minority group has reason to reject it. It violates impartiality. It's disrespectful. But it's been prominent. Well, you can have, the Jews can have their little ghetto here. We'll allow it, as long as you don't interact with us too much, or whatever the ethnic group or religious group. That's a flawed concept. That's not really tolerant, but it masks as tolerant. A more fair conception of tolerance is the respect-based conception of toleration. I should note, what we disagree with, what we might disagree with, but are willing to accept others abiding by. So there's a limit to tolerance, and that limit is what would be not acceptable. Like, let's say a cultural group is practicing cannibalism. Should we tolerate cannibalism? We would say no. That's a bridge too far. That's not acceptable. We shouldn't tolerate it. They can practice we can tolerate their religion, their freedom to practice their religion. But if it involves cannibalism or human sacrifice or something that we think is just outrageous, then we would say, no, we can't tolerate that person. And that's a judgment connected to toleration. What should we tolerate and what should we not? The idea of, so there's a limit, there's some kind of demarcation that needs to be spelled out in any conception of toleration of what we would tolerate and what we wouldn't. And toleration means, no, I don't believe that. I don't believe in your God. I don't believe in your religious doctrine. In fact, I reject your religious doctrine. I do not affirm it. But I acknowledge, I recognize that you have a right to freedom of conscience. And therefore you have a right to believe what you want. Even though I disagree. And I have a right to believe in what I believe in, even though you disagree. Right? You might think I'm just totally bonkers. Totally bonkers. Like, this guy is crazy. He's wacko with his beliefs. But if we respected a right to freedom of conscience, you would say, yeah, Dale, do your thing. As long as it doesn't harm me, and you try to impose your stuff on me, it's all good. You're not harming anyone. Just believe in fairies if you'd like. Believe in magical powers if you like. Because you have a right to believe in what you believe. And that's the essence of the respect-based conception of toleration. And we respect valid rights of association, of conscience, freedom of expression, to choose our own, freedom to choose our own conception of the good life, consistent with the rights of others. Within limits, if we have to define what the limits. But a respect-based notion of tolerance seems to be fairer than a permission-based conception of tolerance. So one of our principles for membership is to invoke and affirm a respect-based conception of tolerance. As long as you accept the rights of others to do the same and reciprocally respect the right to claim a right and to respect the same right in others, that's tolerable, even though we disagree. We can live together. We can have social harmony with each other. We can acknowledge our equal standing in the society, even though we disagree about things. And some basic things, maybe about our religion or our cultural practices, our food, whatever, our dress, although we kind of dress all the same now. Although if you go to New York City, you'll see a variety, more of a pluralism of dress. You get the point, though, right? So I already talked about. So one principle is the idea of toleration, respect-based toleration. Um, so we can also ask what should be our status in the world outside of our nation states. And we can appeal also to the idea of a global society based in human rights. That the idea of human rights, a right to security, a right to liberty, etc., the whole notion of human rights suggests that individual persons have membership and standing in a global moral community. If we acknowledge human rights, then we're acknowledging that persons have standing in a community outside of their own nation, and that one's own nation can be held accountable to those if they violate those rights. So, for example, in Europe, there's a human rights court, a European human rights court, and every citizen of a European country, whatever that country is, if they believe their rights have been violated by their government, can take their case to this European human rights court, and the court can rule against the government of their country in favor of the citizen, on the grounds that they're not only a member of Italy or Germany or Portugal or Spain, they're also a member of Europe. They have standing in Europe. So they can appeal to Europe against their own government if their rights have been violated. That's the beginning of a global society, and suggests that the idea of human rights is signals that we might have membership in a global community. Pertaining to human rights and our standing in a potentially global society. One, we have a human right to membership as a principle of justice. That's enumerated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed after World War II. It's a declaration, it's not technically law, but it declares certain human rights. And a right to membership has been agreed to in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So a human right to membership is everyone has the right to a nationality. That is, everyone has a right to standing in some nation. And no one should be arbitrarily deprived of his or her nationality or denied the right to change his or her rationality. So we have a right to standing in a country, but we also have a right to change our nationality. Also, one could argue for a principle of birthright citizenship, which is fairly common, and we can argue it's very fair. And we as a country have a principle of birthright citizenship. Anyone who is born, any baby that is born in the United States has a claim to citizenship, is a citizen by birth. By birth. Birthright citizenship. So if you're born in a country or born to parents from that country who happen to be traveling to another country perhaps, or stationed in some job or service outside of the country, is a citizen. John McCain, for example, Senator McCain, former presidential but he's by birth a citizen of the United States. So anyone born here, and that's been well established. There's an interesting history about this, which we won't go into. At some points, we have denied birthright citizenship to certain groups of people. The Chinese people, persons of Chinese descent, were in the 19th century were denied birthright citizenship after the Civil War. It was put forth by a delegation from California. Too many Chinese people lived on. So we won't. And then it was written into law, passed by the U.S. Congress, signed by the President. No Chinese person can be, even if born in the United States, can be a citizen. That was overturned, of course, later. So birthright citizenship is an important principle. There's also a human right to political asylum. A human right to political, well acknowledged, and it's also acknowledged in the United States law, domestic law, that individuals, if their national government is commits or allows violation of their human rights, committing perhaps crimes against humanity, then that sovereignty is invalidated. And the individual person, therefore, has a human right to leave that country. If they're being persecuted in that country, they have a right to leave, a human right to leave, and they have a right to be granted political asylum in another country. So other countries are obligated to take in political refugees. And there are, of course, you have to determine guidelines for that. In U.S. law, we have a strong political asylum law. Suggests, yes, we'll take you in, and you'll undergo a review to vet whether your claim of political persecution and human rights violations are valid. If so, we will grant you entry into the United States based on political asylum. And other countries have similar, even stronger provisions for political asylum. So everyone has a right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. And that's a particular principle of membership. The idea of political asylum. We also have a human right to immigrate. We have a right to leave, a general right, human right to leave a country if we so choose. In other words, governments have a duty to let us go if we want to leave. If we choose to leave, then it's our human right to leave one country, to leave perhaps our country of birth, another country. We have the right to leave. And that might be a special case of that is political asylum, but there's a general acknowledged human right of immigration with the E, to immigrate. That is to leave a country. That's a basic principle of no country can hold prisoner, according to this principle, no country can hold their citizens prisoners, in other words. There are countries that do so. North Korea comes to mind. North Koreans can't be very difficult. And that's a violation of their human rights. And then, but do we have a right to immigrate? And it turns out we don't have a right of immigration. can't, we don't have a right to choose whatever country we want and to gain membership in that country. I want to immigrate to Switzerland. Think they'll have me? No. Just because I want to go to Switzerland and be a citizen of Switzerland, I'm making this up, and be a member of Switzerland, they have a right to refuse me. The Swiss government and the Swiss people have a right to say, no, we don't want you. Or, we might want you, but you have to go through this process. So there's no, in that sense, there's no right, human right to immigration with an I. It's up to the host country, the receiving country, who they admit in, and especially as permanent members of the as citizens or residents of the society. And there are certain principles, perhaps, that we could identify. There are certain principles that we can identify to determine on what grounds immigration should proceed. What would determine a fair process of immigration from the point of view of the host country. And we'll discuss those principles going forward. Any questions? I know we're about to run out of time. Is this making sense? Yeah. These ideas. So on Thursday, next class, we'll work in groups on whose security. And then next Tuesday is fall break. No class next Tuesday. And we'll pick up who belongs on the following days. So please email your initial draft of whose security to your group and to me. And we'll see you on Thursday.